My name is Mara Whitlock, and I'm 37. Most people don't remember meeting me. That used to bother me. Now I understand it was my greatest advantage. I wasn't born quiet. I learned it. Silence became my shelter early on, long before I understood how dangerous it could be when underestimated. In my family, loud voices won arguments. Quick tempers controlled rooms. If you wanted peace, you observed. If you wanted survival, you listened. So I listened. At school, teachers praised my potential but forgot my name. In group projects, my ideas were used without attribution. At work, I was the one asked to take notes, organize schedules, clean up problems quietly so leadership could look competent publicly. No one thought this was malicious. That's the part people don't understand. Dismissal doesn't always come with cruelty. Sometimes it comes with a smile. By the time I was 29, I had built a reputation as reliable, dependable, invisible. I was the woman you trusted with sensitive information because you didn't believe she'd do anything with it. I was the one you vented to after meetings, the one who stayed late, the one who didn't push. And that's how I learned how power actually works. The night everything crystallized wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no betrayal scene you could replay in your mind. It was subtle, quiet, almost polite. It was a charity gala. I had spent 6 weeks organizing it, secured donors, coordinated vendors, rewrote speeches to avoid legal landmines no one else noticed. The man whose name appeared as event chair showed up 30 minutes before doors opened. He shook my hand like we were strangers. During the event, I stood near the back of the room, watching donors applaud his speech, a speech I had written, word for word. When applause erupted, he nodded graciously, accepted praise, accepted credit. My name wasn't mentioned once. When the night ended, he handed me his coat and said, "Great support tonight." Support. That word echoed longer than it should have. I went home and didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't fantasize about confrontation. Instead, I opened my laptop and reviewed the event's financials one last time, out of habit. That's when I noticed the discrepancy. A donation that had been recorded, but never deposited. It was small enough to miss, large enough to matter, and familiar enough to make me pause. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't ask questions. I simply copied the file and saved it to a private folder. I labeled it with the date. I told myself it was nothing, but something had changed. From that night on, I stopped seeing systems as neutral. I started seeing patterns, who benefited, who spoke the loudest, who controlled narratives, who cleaned up messes quietly. And I began keeping records, not because I wanted revenge, not yet. Because once you see the machinery behind power, you can't unsee it. And I was done being surprised. There's a specific kind of freedom that comes with being overlooked. It took me years to realize it, but once I did, I stopped trying to correct people's assumptions about me. After the charity gala, nothing outwardly changed. No one apologized. No one followed up. My role remained the same: support, logistics, cleanup. I was still the woman people asked to handle things quietly while they took the spotlight. But internally, something had shifted. I was no longer participating blindly. I was watching with intention. People say power corrupts. That's not entirely true. Power reveals. It removes the need for performance. When people think they're safe, unquestioned, unchallenged, they become careless. They talk too much. They relax their masks. I became very good at creating that sense of safety. I listened during elevator rides, when people thought conversations were private. I stayed after meetings, not to be helpful, but to hear what was said once the room emptied. I learned which executives avoided emails and preferred verbal instructions, which numbers were rounded for simplicity, which donations passed through 3 hands before landing where they were supposed to, and slowly, patterns emerged. The missing donation from the gala wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a rhythm, a habit. Funds moved just enough to avoid alarms. Paperwork signed just early enough to avoid review. Every decision defensible in isolation, irrefutable only when connected. So I connected them. I didn't keep files on my work computer. I used an encrypted drive I paid for in cash. Every document was saved with dates, sources, and context. I didn't label anything evidence. That would have been emotional. I labeled things reference. Around that time, I was offered a lateral move to another department. No raise, no title change, just more access. I accepted immediately. People assumed I was grateful. In my new role, I handled compliance coordination, an unglamorous position that required interfacing with legal, finance, and operations. It came with long hours and no recognition. It also came with visibility into everything. I learned how audits were delayed without being canceled, how consultants were selected not for expertise, but loyalty, how internal reports were softened before external review. No one thought to restrict my access. Why would they? I wasn't ambitious. I didn't push. I didn't challenge authority. I didn't need to. The more invisible I became, the more people trusted me. They vented freely, complained about each other, justified shortcuts, explained decisions they'd never put in writing. One afternoon, a senior director closed my office door and said, "Off the record." That phrase always meant the opposite. He explained a workaround they'd been using to reroute funds during fiscal shortfalls. Temporary, he said. Harmless. Common practice. He trusted me, he said. I nodded. Took notes. Asked neutral questions. Later that evening, I cross-referenced his explanation with financial data from 3 years earlier. The workaround wasn't temporary. It was structural. And it wasn't harmless. By then, I understood something crucial. This wasn't about one corrupt individual. It was about a culture that rewarded opacity and punished curiosity. I didn't want revenge on a person. I wanted accountability for a system, so I made myself indispensable to that system. I became the one people relied on to fix mistakes quietly. The one who smoothed over discrepancies before they reached regulators. The one who made leadership look competent, all while preserving originals, all while watching. People often ask later why I didn't speak up sooner, why I didn't warn anyone, why I waited. They misunderstand what waiting was. Waiting wasn't fear. Waiting was strategy. Because when the truth finally surfaced, it needed to land where it couldn't be ignored. And I was getting closer. By the time people began trusting me, they had already stopped seeing me. Trust isn't built through grand gestures. It's built through consistency, through showing up, through never embarrassing anyone publicly, through fixing problems quietly and taking the blame when necessary. I mastered that language. And once you speak it fluently, doors open without resistance. I was invited into meetings I wasn't technically qualified for, not because of my title, but because I was safe. I didn't posture. I didn't compete. I didn't challenge authority in front of others. I asked questions privately. That distinction mattered. People revealed more in those quiet follow-ups than they ever did in conference rooms. They explained decisions they couldn't defend publicly. Shared pressures they didn't want documented. Confessed mistakes they assumed I would protect. And I did protect them, just not in the way they thought. One executive in particular relied on me heavily. I'll call him Thomas, not because that was his name, but because it doesn't matter. Men like him exist everywhere. He was charming in meetings, ruthless behind the scenes, and deeply insecure about being exposed as less competent than his reputation suggested. Thomas made me his confidant. He asked me to sanitize reports before board reviews, to adjust language, to omit footnotes, to reframe timelines, always small, always reasonable, always with plausible explanations. I never refused. Instead, I asked for context, background, historical data. I positioned my requests as concern, not challenge, and Thomas, relieved to be understood, gave me everything: emails, drafts, verbal approvals, instructions that crossed legal lines but sounded benign when spoken aloud. I documented them all. At this point, my archive had grown beyond anything I initially imagined. It wasn't a revenge file. It was a map, a record of how decisions flowed, who authorized what, who benefited, who cleaned up afterward, and I noticed something else. The people at the top didn't control as much as they pretended. They relied on layers of intermediaries, on specialists, on coordinators like me, people who knew how the system actually functioned. That realization changed my strategy. I stopped thinking about exposure and started thinking about leverage. Around this time, a restructuring was announced. Departments would be consolidated, roles evaluated. It was framed as efficiency. I recognized it as fear. Fear makes people careless. Thomas began asking for favors outside my job description, to attend meetings in his place, to respond to emails under his name, to manage communications while he handled bigger picture matters. I agreed. And just like that, I became his shadow. I spoke to vendors, negotiated timelines, clarified financials. I learned which corners he cut and why. I learned who covered for him and who quietly resented him. Most importantly, I learned how replaceable he actually was. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who believed I was harmless had handed me his authority. Not formally, not visibly, but functionally. One evening, after a particularly long day, Thomas joked, "Honestly, I don't know what I'd do without you." I smiled, because I did. By then, I had begun laying groundwork elsewhere. Discreet conversations, external consultations framed as hypothetical scenarios. I wasn't exposing anyone yet, but I was testing reactions. What would happen if certain information surfaced? Who would panic? Who would deny? Who would move to contain? Patterns emerged quickly. Some people had contingency plans. Others relied entirely on silence. Silence, I learned, was the weakest defense. I didn't hate these people. That's what made it easier. Emotion clouds judgment. Detachment sharpens it. I wasn't interested in punishment. I was interested in inevitability. And inevitability requires preparation. By the end of that year, I had something far more valuable than evidence. I had timing. When people stop acknowledging your contributions, they assume you've stopped contributing. That assumption is useful. The restructuring rolled out exactly as I expected, fast, vague, and framed as progress. Titles changed. Reporting lines blurred. Entire teams were absorbed into new departments with polished language and no real clarity. I lost my title, not officially. On paper, my role was redefined. In practice, I became a resource without ownership. I wasn't leading projects anymore. I was supporting initiatives, consulting, advising. Some colleagues were furious on my behalf. Others barely noticed. Thomas didn't see the danger. He congratulated me on being flexible, told me adaptability would be rewarded, assured me my work was seen. It was, and that was exactly the point. I let others take credit for projects I structured. I watched presentations delivered using my frameworks, my language, my risk analysis. My name stayed off the slides. What they didn't realize was that credit attracts scrutiny. When something succeeds, people ask how. When something fails, they ask who. By stepping back publicly, I removed myself from both. Behind the scenes, my access increased. I was pulled into special projects, sensitive reviews, crisis response teams, roles where documentation was thin and trust was paramount. I became the person leadership relied on when they needed discretion. Discretion is where truths surface. I saw which numbers were massaged before external audits, which reports were delayed until pressure faded, which consultants were paid to confirm conclusions already decided. And I noticed something else. The people taking credit were becoming visible in ways they couldn't control. Thomas, especially, he enjoyed the spotlight. He accepted praise eagerly. He attached his name to initiatives he barely understood. He spoke confidently about outcomes he hadn't verified. He was building a reputation. I was building an exit. During this time, I began preparing contingencies. I consulted quietly with specialists, compliance, governance, investment strategy, under the guise of professional development. I asked theoretical questions, presented anonymized scenarios. No one suspected a thing. I also began separating myself financially from my employer, Nothing dramatic, just discipline, saving, investing, ensuring independence. That part mattered more than anyone realizes. Power is fragile when you depend on the very system you intend to challenge. By the end of restructuring, several senior roles were eliminated. Others were promoted. The hierarchy shifted. I stayed exactly where I was, unmoved, uncelebrated, unnoticed. People assumed I had plateaued, that I lacked ambition, that I was content with stability. They mistook patience for complacency. Then came the request that changed everything. I was asked to coordinate an internal review, one that would inform board-level decisions. Officially, it was a formality. Unofficially, it was designed to justify choices already made. I accepted. And for the first time, I was given authority without oversight. Not because they trusted me, because they didn't think I mattered. That was their final miscalculation. The internal review was supposed to be simple, a rubber stamp process, a confirmation of the new hierarchy. Everyone assumed it would reinforce the decisions already made. Everyone assumed I would follow instructions. I didn't. I built the framework differently. I started with the numbers. Every transaction, every memo, every approval note, every email trail. I connected things that had been deliberately left separate. I flagged inconsistencies that were invisible unless you had patience, and patience was my specialty. I didn't present anything yet. I just built the system, and then I listened. People didn't realize they were revealing everything to me. Thomas bragged about solutions he'd engineered. Another executive casually mentioned consultants who had been paid to suppress inconvenient findings. A finance lead detailed a workaround for quarterly reporting, almost laughing, thinking I wouldn't notice. I noticed. I documented. I cross-referenced. I saved screenshots. I filed notes. Every explanation, every excuse, every rationalization. By the end of the first week, I had enough to create a map. A full map of the company's decision-making underhandedness. Patterns, connections, lies, omissions, it was all there. The irony was delicious. The review was supposed to find nothing of consequence. But by letting people speak freely, by letting them assume I was powerless, I found everything. And I was just getting started. Thomas began to lean on me more heavily, delegating more responsibility, asking me to verify details before submitting reports. He assumed my loyalty, my competence, my invisibility. All three were weapons. I began introducing subtle stress tests, hypothetical questions in meetings, requests for clarifications. I watched reactions. I tested boundaries. I confirmed who would cover for mistakes, who would panic, who would deflect responsibility, and who would try to silence the discussion entirely. Every reaction was data. Every hesitation, every defensiveness, every slip became part of the picture. By the end of the month, I had the whole story, not just the numbers, but the people. And I was ready, not to act yet. That would be premature. I had to wait for the perfect alignment of facts, timing, and opportunity. But soon, the first cracks appeared. One small mistake, an unapproved transfer, an email sent to the wrong recipient, triggered confusion among senior leadership. I waited silently. Let the panic bloom. Let people scramble. Because when you control the map, you control the panic. By the time Thomas realized the discrepancy, I had already traced it back to a chain of decisions he thought were invisible. I didn't accuse him, I didn't intervene, I only corrected it quietly. He was relieved. I was smiling internally. The review continued. People whispered. Errors compounded. Accountability became chaotic. But I remained untouchable. Because untouchable is the state people underestimate most. By quietly controlling the flow of information, I was becoming indispensable. By quietly observing, I was becoming inevitable. And I knew the moment would come when the map I had created could no longer be ignored. Everyone thinks the first crack is dramatic. That there will be shouting, explosions, a scene no one can ignore, not here, not now. The first mistake happened quietly. It was Thomas, of course. The man who trusted me most, who relied on me most, who assumed I would never challenge him. He signed an internal memo incorrectly. Dates wrong, figures misaligned, approvals missing. Small. Insignificant. Invisible except to someone paying attention. I noticed immediately, and I waited. Not because I was cruel, because timing is everything. I let the error go unnoticed in his immediate circle. I didn't correct it in the system. I didn't hint at it. I let it propagate quietly, let it ripple. By mid-morning, whispers began. Slight confusion, questions, an employee asking Thomas to clarify, another forwarding the memo to a director. Errors compounded. Thomas tried to regain control. He sent emails, asked for confirmations, scheduled impromptu meetings. I didn't intervene. I stayed silent, because I knew he was doing exactly what I predicted. By lunch, Thomas was flustered. His confidence, once effortless, now felt brittle. Small mistakes that he would have brushed off before were magnified. Everyone was watching. And the funny thing, no one suspected me. I leaned back at my desk. Calm, unfazed, I didn't have to do anything. The system I had quietly mapped and the trust they had given me was doing the work for me. Thomas eventually admitted his mistake in a team meeting. Apologies rushed out, excuses clumsily formed. He blamed miscommunication, lack of oversight, technical glitches. Everyone nodded, partly sympathetic, partly relieved. No one realized what had really happened. I did. I knew that even small cracks become fatal when they accumulate, and this was the first crack. From that moment on, I began observing more intensely. Every decision, every delegation, every casual assumption became data. People revealed themselves when they were stressed, when they thought no one was paying attention. They didn't know someone was. By the end of the week, Thomas had made several more minor mistakes, emails sent too early, approvals overlooked, verbal commitments forgotten. His composure frayed. His credibility eroded. All without me touching a thing, and each time I noted it, each time I mapped it, each time I confirmed my advantage, I didn't celebrate, I didn't gloat, I didn't even smile. I simply waited. Because the first mistake is never the last. And when the perfect moment comes, the consequences will be inevitable. By the time Thomas made his first mistake, the stage was set. But I didn't act directly. I never do. I let the world move for me. The ripple began quietly. One minor error, unnoticed by most, soon influenced decisions across departments. Emails were delayed. Approvals were misfiled. Small miscalculations and reports escalated into confusion during meetings. The beauty of it, everyone assumed it was human error, oversight, bad luck. No one suspected that someone was orchestrating nothing at all. I spent hours reviewing responses. Who blamed whom? Who tried to cover? Who panicked? Who overcompensated? Every reaction was data. Every falter exposed a weakness. By midweek, Thomas's authority had begun to wobble. He sent frantic messages asking for updates that had already been provided. He delegated tasks multiple times, worried someone would discover a missing signature. Colleagues started double-checking everything. Tension grew, and still I said nothing. I smiled quietly to myself in private. Calm, collected, invisible. Then came the first real human consequences. One of the senior associates misread a memo. Acting on the wrong assumption, he reversed a critical transaction. Thomas tried to fix it himself, but in his flustered state, compounded errors began. The mistake reached the CFO, and suddenly a minor issue became a discussion point at executive level. The room was tense. People whispered. Subtle glances were exchanged. And through it all, I sat silently, observing, mapping, noting. Later, Thomas cornered me in the hallway, his voice low, almost pleading. "Mara, I don't understand how this happened." "Can you help me?" I nodded politely. "Of course." He didn't realize that by seeking my help, he was confirming my control. I corrected the immediate issue, carefully guiding him without revealing that I had already traced every misstep. By the end of the week, ripple effects were everywhere. Leaders were second-guessing decisions. Trust between colleagues eroded. Small errors amplified into confusion. And still, I remained untouched, unblinking, calm. It's fascinating what people will reveal when they assume you aren't paying attention. The ripple effect had begun to reshape the room's hierarchy, not by force, but by letting them reveal themselves. Weaknesses exposed themselves, competence faltered, arrogance collapsed under the weight of small mistakes, and I did nothing but watch. Because I had learned the secret that no one else had grasped. You don't need to strike to win. You need to be prepared, and you need to let the world make itself vulnerable. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it would be far too late. And in the meantime, I would remain invisible, untouched, untouchable. By the time the ripple fully reached the boardroom, it was no longer subtle. Small mistakes had grown into undeniable patterns, and leadership could no longer ignore the chaos. And I still hadn't touched a thing. It started with a single presentation, a simple review of quarterly numbers, part of the internal audit I had been coordinating. The room was packed, executives, directors, even Thomas, who still believed he had control. I began calmly, neutral, polite, observing. "Here are the figures," I said, projecting charts and reports. "There are some inconsistencies you may want to note." No emphasis, no alarm, just facts. Eyes flicked toward Thomas first, then the CFO. Then each director, silently calculating who was responsible, who could defend, and who would be blamed. They didn't know what to expect next. I began connecting the dots. Small errors. Missed approvals, delayed memos, funds rooted in ways that looked procedural, but weren't. I traced each one back to a name, a date, a decision. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I simply showed the pattern. It was enough. Gasps, murmurs, slight shuffling in seats. People leaned forward, realizing that what they assumed was isolated incompetence was systemic. Thomas turned pale. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He realized the presentation wasn't just numbers, it was a map, and I had built it. One director whispered to another, "How did she know?" I smiled just slightly, just enough that no one could read too much into it. "You don't understand," Thomas said finally, trying to regain control. "These figures aren't accurate. There must be a mistake." I nodded calmly. I double-checked every source. The numbers matched documentation and approvals exactly. No emotion, no gloating, just truth. By the end of the presentation, several executives were scrambling to verify, to cross-reference, to save face. The errors weren't mine to fix publicly, they were theirs to reconcile. And the responsibility fell squarely where it belonged. Afterward, I stepped out of the room quietly. No congratulations, no recognition, just the knowledge that I had just shifted the balance. I walked down the hallway, passing Thomas, who avoided my eyes. For the first time, he understood that I wasn't a helper, a facilitator, or an observer. I was a presence that could no longer be ignored. And the truth was, he had built this exposure himself, by relying on trust, by assuming my invisibility, by letting the system run unchecked. I hadn't touched anything yet. I hadn't even spoken more than necessary. All I had done was illuminate the consequences of their own actions. By the time the first meeting ended, whispers had spread across the floor, rumors of mismanagement, questions about leadership competence. People were uncomfortable in their own offices. Anxiety replaced confidence, and through it all I remained untouchable, calm, patient, collected, because this was only the beginning. By now, the boardroom was no longer polite. The ripple I had quietly nurtured had become a small wave, and waves have a way of crashing into everything in their path. It started with Thomas. His earlier mistakes, once minor, were now magnified. Emails misfiled, approvals missing, decisions questioned. Directors whispered behind his back. People who had relied on him suddenly hesitated to follow instructions, and still I did nothing. I watched as his confidence faltered, as his words became defensive, as colleagues subtly bypassed him, turning to me for clarification. Not because I wanted control, at least not yet, but because I was the calm center in a room slowly unraveling. One afternoon, a senior associate, usually unnoticed, accidentally forwarded a confidential email chain to the entire leadership team. It contained all the minor oversights I had documented over months, delayed reports, unapproved transactions, and verbal authorizations that weren't recorded. Thomas's face went pale when he saw it. I didn't react. I didn't need to. The chain of errors ignited a scramble. Meetings were convened on the spot. Audits were demanded. Explanations were requested. People were talking over each other, defensive, flustered. The cracks that had existed for months were now glaring, undeniable, and impossible to dismiss. And everyone was looking for someone to blame. Thomas tried to defend himself, tried to rationalize, tried to redirect attention, but the patterns were obvious. The evidence couldn't be refuted. Every accident was connected, every misstep documented, every miscalculation traceable, and the brilliance of it was that no one suspected me. I remained calm, composed, a quiet observer in the chaos I had orchestrated. I answered questions only when necessary, provided clarity only when asked, and never drew attention to myself. The collapse wasn't messy. It wasn't theatrical. It was inevitable, and inevitability is far more terrifying than sudden outrage. By the end of the day, Thomas had been formally reprimanded. Directors who had previously ignored minor errors were now questioning every decision he had made. Confidence in his leadership eroded in hours, a process that would have taken months under normal circumstances. Other executives began second-guessing themselves. Employees whispered in corners. Trust fractured. The structure of authority I had studied for years was unraveling piece by piece. And me, I remained untouchable because I had never acted rashly. I had never overextended. I had only waited, observed, documented, anticipated. By the time people realized the magnitude of what had happened, it was too late. The collapse had already begun. The first wave had hit. The dominoes were falling, and I quietly held the map of the wreckage, because power isn't about force, it's about timing. And the time for subtlety was over. Everything led to this. Every misstep I had documented. Every conversation I had recorded silently in my mind. Every observation I had made over months. Every ripple I had allowed to become a wave. I didn't announce myself. I didn't storm in with accusations. I didn't raise my voice. That's not how power works. Power doesn't demand attention, it commands it. The board called a meeting to address the chaos. Thomas was present, visibly tense, trying to project authority he no longer possessed. The room was full of senior executives, directors, and auditors. Anxiety hung thick in the air. I opened my folder, not dramatically, just a simple, organized set of documents and charts. Everything clearly mapped, everything traceable, every decision linked to its source. I began to speak. Calmly, precisely, neutral. The errors we've experienced are not isolated, I said. They're systemic. They result from processes that lack oversight and accountability. Here is the documentation. As I spoke, I traced the connections. Small mistakes, overlooked approvals, verbal commitments, unrecorded, mismanaged reports. Each one was visible, undeniable. Each one was attributed to decisions made by leadership or lack thereof. Heads turned toward Thomas. Whispers spread. He tried to intervene. I didn't allow it. I merely nodded politely, continuing my presentation. By the end, the room was silent. Not a single person could deny the pattern. Not a single person could argue that this was an accident. Then I stopped. I had said everything necessary. No one needed my judgment. No one needed my interpretation. The evidence spoke for itself. Thomas shifted in his chair, sweat forming at his temples. Colleagues exchanged glances, and in that moment the invisible observer became the authority. The board quietly began asking me for recommendations. Not Thomas, not anyone else. Me, Mara Whitlock. The one they assumed was harmless, invisible, inconsequential. I outlined solutions, process adjustments, oversight mechanisms, transparency protocols. Each recommendation strengthened my position while subtly removing theirs. By the end of the meeting, it was clear. I wasn't just indispensable. I was in control, not because I demanded it, not because I flaunted it, because I had waited, watched, learned, and acted with precision. The first wave of chaos had been allowed to happen. The cracks had exposed every weakness. And now the structure of power itself acknowledged me. Thomas remained, technically, in title, but practically his authority had evaporated. Every misstep, every hesitation, every minor oversight now reflected on him, while I stood apart, calm and unshakable. And in that calm, I felt something extraordinary, the satisfaction of inevitability. I hadn't needed to yell. I hadn't needed to argue. I hadn't even needed to gloat. The world had done the work for me, and now it knew who I was. The moment of reckoning isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't need to be. It is simply the moment people see what they have ignored for far too long and realize they have no defenses left. Thomas was first. He tried to speak, to justify himself, to explain why the discrepancies weren't his fault. I listened politely, nodding. "I understand," I said finally, calm, even. "But the facts are clear. Decisions made, errors allowed, oversights ignored, they're all documented. And now accountability is required." It wasn't anger. It wasn't vengeance. It was inevitability. He swallowed hard. His confidence, once effortless, had vanished. And he understood, in a way he never would have believed, that the system he had relied upon to protect him had turned against him, not because of me, but because of his own misjudgment. Then came the others. Executives, directors, associates, everyone who had taken credit, ignored minor errors, or assumed I was powerless. They shuffled uneasily, realizing that their oversight had consequences. I didn't insult them. I didn't raise my voice. I merely presented evidence, connections, and outcomes. The room was silent. I let it sink in. Every hesitation, every glance exchanged, every subtle shift of body language told me more than words ever could. People began to understand. Their decisions, their arrogance, their assumptions, they had led to this moment. And the truth, they had created it themselves. By the end of the day, Thomas was formally removed from decision-making authority. Others were asked to revise reports, clarify actions, and take responsibility. It wasn't humiliation. It was accountability, and it was long overdue. I left the room quietly. No one congratulated me. No one followed me out, and that was perfect. Recognition is a fleeting thing. Control lasts. Walking down the hall, I reflected on the months of patience it had taken to reach this point. Observing, waiting, documenting, letting the system expose itself. The reckoning was never about revenge. It was about truth, about fairness, about finally showing that being underestimated does not equal weakness. And in that truth, I reclaimed more than just authority. I reclaimed dignity. I walk through the office now, and it's different. The air feels lighter, clearer, but charged with respect. Not the kind people demand. It's the kind people give when they know they have no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Everything is in its place. The system runs smoothly, decisions are transparent, accountability is standard, and chaos has been replaced with order. But the most satisfying part, I did this without raising my voice, without grandstanding, without forcing anyone to see me. I wasn't the loudest. I wasn't the most visible. I was underestimated. And that, ironically, gave me the freedom to act without interference. Thomas doesn't speak to me anymore, not because he's angry, but because he knows I am untouchable. Other executives approach me cautiously, deferentially, because they recognize the power of someone who observes, waits, and moves with precision. I sit at my desk, reviewing the systems I've put in place. Nothing flashy, nothing showy, just clean, solid, unassailable. Every process I've documented, every interaction I've carefully preserved, every error I've observed has become part of an ecosystem where truth cannot be ignored. I think back to the first charity gala, the night I was invisible. The night I learned how easily people dismiss what they cannot see or hear. I smile faintly. That invisibility was never a weakness. It was armor. Patience was my weapon. Observation, my strategy. And action? My timing was impeccable. I didn't need applause. I didn't need recognition. I needed control, and now I have it. And here's what the world learned. Power doesn't announce itself. Strength doesn't shout. Authority doesn't demand. It waits. It watches. It acts when the moment is inevitable. I am Mara Whitlock. I was underestimated, dismissed, ignored. And now I am untouchable. The world finally cannot forget me.